So hello. Well, I'm going to start with the truth. I don't like the title I've been given. Still, I'll no doubt work around it and I'll try and get my points across and try and weave it into the title of the talk, Wholesome Speech. I'll simply give the talk a subtitle, After My Mother, and a constant reminder that still echoes in my mind. So my title of this talk is now Wholesome Speech, or if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. Anyway, I will be exploring this ethical principle or precept and continue our exploration of the 5 precepts practiced by Buddhists around the world. And this Sangha Morning particularly focused on the 4th precept, abstention from false speech, or its positive rendering, truthful speech. To remind you of the other precepts that we have covered over the last 3 weeks, before we head into our next adventure. Firstly, loving kindness. Secondly, generosity. And last week, we reflected on stillness, simplicity, and contentment. So I'm going to begin with the poetry of Thomas Tranströmer, who in fact owes something to Japanese Buddhism, as early in his career he wrote haiku. So I'm just going to start with a section from his poetry entitled Preludes. 2 truths approach each other. One comes from inside, the other from outside. And where they meet, we have a chance to catch sight of ourselves. So there is something about the need to communicate that exemplifies human existence. Whoever we are, we need to communicate, to connect. Even the Buddha needed to communicate his experience. And it is indeed a mysterious thing if one really thinks about it. And perhaps this is why our teacher, Bhante, entitled one of his talks from the Vimalakirtinadesha, which we're going to return to, The Mystery of Human Communication. Our communication with others clearly lets us know how we are feeling, whether metaphor, kind, considerate and patient. And it also shows when we are snappy, unkind and impatient. And it certainly shows to the other person too. Speech is always a working ground. Thus, we need to continually purify our speech through this precept. With truthful communication, I purify my speech. It can never be perfected. It can always be improved. We should always have a cutting edge to our practice. And if you're struggling to find something to work on, well, speech is always something to come back to. Even if it's not to your benefit, it certainly will be for the benefit of others. So Sangha says, speech is the area of activity in which much of our ethical practice takes place. It is the first and often the only outlet through which our thoughts and feelings find expression. Truthful speech is how we would naturally and spontaneously speak if we were enlightened. But because we are not, we need to make an effort to practice this precept constantly. We have to be mindful time and time again and really take care. We need to think before we speak, following the Buddha's advice before speaking. Is what we are saying factual? Is it helpful? Is it kind? Is it pleasant? And is it timely? So when we are trying to be faithful to this precept, we need to be working on areas such as omissions. For example, not telling the whole truth, which gives the wrong impression, and missing certain parts out, perhaps that don't paint us in such favourable light, as well as lies and exaggerations and embellishments of the truth. Something also worth considering is whether we are using speech that is vague. Are we being clear? It could be that the issue is around intensity. It can be difficult to really look at something, to discuss something fully, but the truth really can liberate. If we are not truthful, we don't necessarily let anyone into our world. And in fact, we can end up just kidding ourselves. So although we're dealing with the fourth precept, I do not think it's possible to look at this precept without considering its relation to the other speech precepts that one takes at ordination. So in addition to truthful speech, there's abstention from harsh speech and its positive counterpart, kindly, affectionate speech. Kindly speech is an expression of metta and non-violence, and ultimately as a means of unification of the Sangha. Abstention from frivolous speech or meaningful speech primarily is to help the spiritual development of the individual. It's an integration, the bringing together of head and heart. Sometimes we're just uncomfortable with silence and feel the need to cover this up with chit-chat. Then there's abstention from slanderous speech. Its aim is to go beyond the limited sense of ourselves and others and to speak harmoniously. Speech that at its best goes beyond ourselves. And then when we go beyond ourselves, then we can experience insight into how things really are. And we could add to the speech precepts, including listening. Webster's dictionary defines listen as to pay attention to sound and to hear with thoughtful attention. Yet effective listening means paying attention to more than just sound, and therefore requires that we use more than just our ears. As we are increasingly able to bring mindfulness to ordinary human interaction, we find that listening means attending to our physical sensations, our thoughts, emotions, as well as to the voice, facial expressions, gestures and pauses, the underlying meanings and nuances that accompany the spoken words of others. This type of listening is what Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh calls deep listening. Right listening is both a skill and a way of being. In her book, The Zen of Listening, Rebecca Sharif writes, listening is one of our greatest potential natural resources, yet it is by far one of the most undeveloped abilities. So we could all try and develop this skill further. And perhaps we could really try with those that we're more familiar with, those we spend our time with. Sometimes we don't listen as much to those we really care about. Bhante says, you're not speaking the truth unless you speak the whole truth, unless you say what's really in your heart and really in your mind. But what do we really think and what do we really feel? Do we really know what we think? Do we really know what we feel? Most people, if you can really admit it, and if we're really honest, are in a state of confusion. We're in a state of bewilderment. We don't really know what we think or what we feel. And if we don't know ourselves in the depths as well as the heights, if we can't really penetrate into the depths of our own being, if we really can't be transparent to ourselves, if there isn't any clarity within, any light within, then we can't speak the truth. So a question might be, in what areas or ways could we be more honest with ourselves? I'm studying Dogen at the moment from his Genjo Koan, and the most famous and quoted passage from this text, and probably the whole of Dogen's writing. To comprehend the Buddha way is to comprehend the self. To comprehend the self is to forget the self. So David Brazier surmises that this is not to comprehend or study, as some translations say, to accumulate knowledge about oneself, but to observe ourselves more deeply, so that in fact we become disenchanted. We realize the self isn't all it's cracked up to be, and in fact we're quite ordinary. Each day we all get up, we get ready, perhaps we go to work, go to sleep, we eat, we experience satisfaction and dissatisfaction, we experience praise and gain, and a whole host, of course, of unsavory habits. Our knowing ourselves is not seeing how wonderful we are, but really how vulnerable we are, how frail, how prone to error, and even how foolish one is. So in practice, to know the self is to realize how limited one is. It is to see our foolish nature. It is to reach a familiarity with oneself just as an ordinary being. When one is nothing more nor less, we'll stop being so preoccupied with it. And when we see this, we can be truly honest. We're not needing to cover up our shortcomings. We can say what's really going on, knowing that we're not special. In fact, there's nothing wrong with that. Bhante says it's not about dumping the truth on others, but knowing the truth involves appreciating what those facts mean for people and how they connect with them. He says that the implications are that of developing love and kindness. This means being skillful in our communication. So the more honest we are, the bigger the perspective that also includes our strengths and our working grounds. Truthfulness is much more than not just telling lies. But in fact, that's just the starting point, the first level. When speech is at its highest level, speech culminates in harmony, in oneness, in mutual self-transcendence, and also at the same time culminates in silence. So perhaps silence is best exemplified in the Vimalakirti Nadesha, in the final climatic scene of the sutra, in which Vimalakirti suggests that the assembled bodhisattvas tell about their understanding of reality. All 31 bodhisattvas present a profound teaching on their understanding, but of course all their statements are themselves dualistic and cannot really represent reality. In fact, you cannot actually say anything about it at all. So when Manjushri turns to Vimalakirti and asks him to expound his own realization, Vimalakirti remains silent, a thunderous silence. Vimalakirti's silence gives the fullness of expression and communication that simultaneously demonstrates the limitations of language. The vision of communication and its highest culmination as part of the goal is expressed now in the following sutra, which tells the moving story of Aniruddha and his friends, which I'd like to finish on. So make sure you're sitting comfortably. And here they are, the Aniruddhas. So Aniruddha, Nandya and Kimberly are staying together in a quiet forest grove, where the Buddha goes to visit them one evening after emerging from solitary meditation. On becoming aware of their teacher's arrival, the 3 monks hasten to welcome him, one relieving him of his bowl and outer robe, another making his seat ready, the third bringing water to bathe his feet. When they are all seated, the Buddha first checks that they are in good health and adequately supplied with food. He then begins to ask them about their way of life together. His first question is, in essence, whether they get on well with one another. Aniruddha confirms that he and the other 2 are living in concord, with mutual appreciation, without disputing, blending like milk and water, viewing each other with kindly eyes. The Buddha, who knows very well that not all monks get along so cordially, inquires how they manage to do so. Aniruddha explains that he considers himself fortunate to be living the spiritual life together with such companions as Nandya and Kimberly. To do so, in his opinion, is a great gain for him. The way they live together is an expression of metta. Accordingly, he maintains a positive attitude towards the other two in every possible way: kindly deeds, affectionate speech, and loving thoughts. Anuruddha's words suggest that he has developed metta towards his companions as a practice, something nurtured through mindfulness, a conscious part of the spiritual life. However, what began as a practice has now become second nature. He has reached the point of routinely putting the other's desires before his own. He simply asks himself, why shall I not set aside what I wish to do and do what the others wish to do? And when he does precisely that, in conclusion, he tells the Buddha, we are different in body, Venerable Sir, but one in mind. Nandia and Kimbala, for their part, reply to the Buddha in the same way, each saying he has surrendered his own inclinations and is living according to the will of the other two. They all agree they are different in body, but one in mind. As they are all given up their wills to each other, there is no question of one dominating the other two. It seems that their experience is a shared will, or rather a mysterious coincidence of wills based on a deep mutual awareness and harmony. The Buddha expresses his approval of his three friends' way of life and inquires what spiritual fruits it's produced. He asks them, but while you abide thus, have you attained any superhuman state, a distinction in knowledge and vision worthy of the noble ones? Replying on behalf of the others, Anuruddha now reveals that all three of them have passed through the whole range of spiritual and transcendental attainments. In other words, they are all fully enlightened. The Buddha is delighted by this wonderful news. Eventually, after some further talk, he leaves them. And at this point, Nandia and Kimbala have a question for Anuruddha. Have we ever told you that we have achieved all those things that you have credited us with? In reply, Anuruddha admits that the other two haven't actually told him such. Nevertheless, he knows their abidings and attainments by encompassing their minds with his own. In other words, he has direct knowledge of their inner states without any need for words. The fact that Anuruddha can speak confidently of Nandia's and Kimbala's spiritual attainments without having heard anything of the subject suggests that the expression one in mind is not just a figure of speech, but more literally true than we might ever have imagined. So, the story of the three friends shows us that true communication within spiritual friendship simultaneously belongs to both the path and the goal of Buddhism. This is when truths approach each other, when one comes from inside, the other from outside. This is where they meet, and we really see ourselves. So thank you for joining us.